Hello, and welcome to the Scholar's Nook, where we offer mindful tips for the budding scholar. I am Dr. Nick Wolf. Again, joining me is Dr. Stephen Lindenberger. Welcome, Stephen.
How you doing, Nick?
Top of the world, my friend.
Good.
Today
Yeah.
we're going to delve into the thoughts of Dr. Robert K. Merton. One of the major contributions of his, a sociologist from the mid 20th century, concerns the sociology of science. Now, he established four norms that he considered what makes the scientific enterprise different from other social systems. It was his belief that these norms protected science from the corrupting influences of more readily available and readily affected other organizations and other social systems. So, in brief, these Mertonian norms consist of the following: disinterestedness. In an effort to maintain objectivity, researchers should strive to avoid conflicts of interest in our research. Universalism. The tools of science are available to everyone. Communalism. The products of science should be freely shared. And organized skepticism. We refuse to accept scientific claims unless those claims and the methods that create them are subject to scrutiny. Now, why do I explore these ideas? Because I think we need to have an important part of what we do as researchers is to understand what's the ideals of science and and how do we keep ourselves honest in the way we develop our ideas. And I think this set of norms here can be very helpful for us to make sure that we are doing our jobs correctly. So, Dr. Lindenberger, I expect we'll examine each of these norms in their turn, but do you have any comments on this list on the whole?
No, I think it's fascinating. It's a fascinating topic. Um, the organized skepticism, I think, jumps out at me as one of the most important because we've seen, you know, um, there was a social scientist in Denmark, I believe, who had his entire catalog of articles pulled. He lost his PhD because he had falsified, set up, totally fake experiments. And then, even though everything was published, the skeptic and a few of the scholars that looked at his work said, "This is too neat. Uh, it's almost like you can predict what the guy is going to find in every study." And so they started digging into it, and sure enough, it was all fabricated. So that one jumped out at me because of that example.
I totally agree with you. And there are a number of high profile examples, particularly in the recent couple of years, that some big names in science have been revealed to have questionable at best approaches to their research. So it's I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah.
Now, Stephen, do you know who Gene Roddenberry is?
Yes, of course.
Gene Roddenberry, of course, is the creator of Star Trek.
Right.
Now, Gene Roddenberry politically identified somewhat closely with communism, and he
Right.
created Star Trek to provide an example of how communism will come to pass once we conquer greed, corruption, and scarcity. Star Trek is utopian science fiction. I bring this up because I contend that Mertonian norms are utopian science.
Hmm.
Are you checking with me? Is that a reasonable
I
argument, you
like
think?
it. Keep going. I like where you're going with this.
Now, don't misunderstand me. I believe these utopian impulses come from a good place and they have value. However, to be useful, I believe these norms should be examined in the context of the complexity of the modern world, and in particular, the modern workplace. Does that sound fair?
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, in that case, let's get started with disinterestedness. If the researcher stands to benefit from the outcomes of the research, the potential for bias or outright corruption of the research increases. And when we talk about being interested in the scientific process, Much of that discussion centers on awards and paydays and generous research grants from special interests. No doubt these material incentives do play a role, but I contend that there are three motivations that eclipse all the others. One, we want to be right. Number two, we want to make our mark in the field. And three, we want to justify our agenda or our worldview. I contend that it's our pride and self-importance that is our downfall as researchers. What say you about that?
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself, Nick.
Interesting. Okay. Have you ever read the Righteous Mind?
You've mentioned it to me before, but I have not read it. No.
Okay. For the viewers here, The Righteous Mind was written by a social psychologist named Jonathan Haidt, and it's a fantastic book that discusses the fundamental building blocks of moral psychology. In The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt argues that we use our intellect to give ourselves a logical rationale to justify our emotional impulses. Even if we were being influenced by these material incentives, we will always provide ourselves a noble sounding justification for our behavior. Justifications that take the form of, I want to be right, I want to make my mark, and I want to justify my worldview. Furthermore, while we generally enjoy extensive ethics training as it pertains to conflicts of interest that may enrich us, I feel that we don't have nearly the same preparation for those ethical dilemmas that pertain to our advocacy. What say you? What am I missing here?
No, you're absolutely right on track. Once again, I love where you're going with this, Nick. Yeah.
All right, sounds good. All right, so if we are okay with this interestedness, well, first of all, I'll say, but what do I look for in being disinterested? The only interest I have is in the truth.
Right.
I care when I'm trying to. I believe science is a part of our sense-making apparatus and our truth-seeking apparatus, and I try to the extent that I possibly can as a flawed human being, to try and put all of the other things aside. I'm just trying to figure out what is real and how to best understand it.
Right.
Okay. Now we'll turn the page to universalism. Universalism is the high-minded principle that it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, who your parents are, regardless of our beliefs on other issues. It doesn't matter your race, gender, religion, or even your credentials or professional reputation. The tools of science are yours. More than that, despite all of those differences, everyone, from the lowliest graduate student to the most published researcher in the world, everyone competes on equal footing. Science is supposed to be, small d, democratic. We can all agree that folks who work to complete a doctoral degree may have more training to do science well, but that does not mean that that anyone who finds a way to qualify himself or herself is unable to do science. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that not only energizing, but liberating. We are not condemned to receive wisdom from up on high. We can all find our way closer to the truth. And I think that's an awesome thing. What do you think about that?
I totally agree. I think, you know, when you talk about the workplace, I mean, you are talking about research in the scientific community, the academy, if you will, but you also mentioned the workplace. I think it's really important for us to realize too that, what you said, we want to strive to be correct. We want our worldviews to be confirmed a lot of times, but when you move that into a group setting or an organizational setting, what happens is we end up kind of living in the truth and self-confirmation of the people at the top too. So we help perpetuate, ideas. Let me put it this way. I read a really interesting article one time that said that within organizations, we pretty much live with it. We're living out the psychodrama of the person in charge. Okay. So that's another layer that we have to think about when we, on an individual level, yes, we want to be right. We want to have our worldview confirmed. It keeps us less agitated and uncomfortable. But you have to also understand that there's a real influence of groups and teams and organizations on that process as well.
There's effective of our groups, but also about the power dynamics that are at work too, that we are all swimming into, that does affect even unconsciously how we see information and how we arrange the information to certain conclusions.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to add that point.
Now, I would say that science works so long as everybody has the opportunity to advance new ideas or challenge the old ones, and the claims of both can be constantly interrogated by anyone in the pursuit of truth. The moment one's claims can no longer be interrogated, we've now left the realm of science and we've entered into dogma. And I think that is a very dangerous place to be.
Right.
Now, Stephen, not everyone agrees with the concept of universalism. Some of these concerns are legitimate. You kind of alluded to one before about the groupthink potential or some real ramifications having power differentials, which can sometimes be justified. But in a world where companies and organizations can be held liable for the behaviors of its agents, credentials are used to provide objective verification for one's qualifications, which is useful because credentialism is important just as a liability protection issue. But credentialism can be taken too far. In the academy and in elsewhere, there's a subset of folks who operate within what they see as a cognitive or technological elite. They believe themselves to be the smartest people in the room, and they consider the normal people working in science to be riffraff, who are corrupting science. Now, people who come from this belief have forgotten, in my view, what science is all about, and they need to be reminded of their role of professional scrutiny. Has this matched your experience? Is there sometimes an issue of elitism in science?
Absolutely. And as you were talking about that, if I may, I just pulled up a section out of an article that I wrote with a colleague about that actually addresses this. And I think this is based on Friedman's work in Failure of Nerve, but he posits that there's three fallacies that we live by: expertise, empathy, and self. So I think you're talking about the fallacy of expertise.
True.
Which is an orientation to data and technique rather than toward emotional processes. And it's a desperate search for certainty. So I think that's related, isn't it? And the regressive effects are that it limits creativity, takes focus off of transcendent purpose, and devalues individual contribution.
That's totally the case. And particularly if working in the social sciences,
right,
where certainty is not really achievable in social sciences, because the wonder of human variation means that there are no hard and fast rules. We only have tendencies, and that's important to realize.
Right. So this fallacy of expertise, I think, really lines up pretty closely with what you were talking about there, Nick.
Precisely. I think we'll touch on another one here in a moment, because the other group that I see has a real problem with universalism are the folks who embrace exclusively standpoint epistemology. These folks believe that objective truth is generally unknowable, and that the best people qualified to study a subject are those who have lived experience within the subject. Now, while I appreciate that having firsthand knowledge of a subject can provide certain insights, I'd suggest that it's not universally true, and that it is my view that subjects are best explored by a balance of those who are up close in personal interactions, as well as those who are more reserved and objective perspectives. Is that fair? Am I missing something here?
No, I think it's very fair.
And I think that kind of goes to what I believe one of the points you said in that article was about uh, uh, the the fallacy of empathy.
Right, right. And
That's
that's in my article, it's defined as the use of togetherness to get those who are perceived to have power to adapt to the least mature, differentiated members of the group.
and the a lot of your folks who again embrace standpoint epistemology are totally enraptured by empathy, which sometimes can color our ability to see things clearly because we're too invested in our subjects. And
Right,
there's some value from having a little bit of distance between the observer and the observed.
right. And in the article I'm referencing, the regressive effects of empathy include reduced personal responsibility. It breaks down resistance to manipulation and exacerbates already existing social inequities. So it lines up perfectly with what you're talking about, Nick.
Absolutely. All right, let's turn the page and look at communalism. Now, communalism asserts that the ideas, the methods, and the discoveries and the data obtained through science should be shared freely and openly. Science advances through the growth of our collective knowledge because all knowledge constitutes a scaffold upon which we all work. We, as it were, stand on the shoulders of giants, and the sharing of ideas fosters serendipity and the creation of novel concepts. And that the more we hold back, the more we stifle our own growth. What do you think about the concept of communalism in science?
Um, I mean, and again, this really is your wheelhouse. I'm kind of new to this, but if I understand it right, and please correct me if I'm misinterpreting, but I do like the idea that we all should have access to the knowledge gained from the scientific method, right? Um, and that everybody uh, should be able to make decisions based on the results. What am I missing there? I feel like I'm maybe not completely understanding it.
I don't think you're missing anything. I think that is the best argument that can be made is that the more we're sharing, the more we're growing upon each other and we're all growing our knowledge together.
Right. Okay.
But, and there's always a but, isn't there?
There is.
Uh, this is another utopian impulse that, although I appreciate, needs some further examination. Not everyone buys into the concept of communalism, particularly when we work to apply scientific tools beyond the academy. Because of so much of what makes our companies and organizations successful is a consequence of our proprietary knowledge, we definitely have impulses that inhibit our sharing. Moreover, when we study these organizations, we often study how things are going wrong, and this may be embarrassing or lay bare vulnerabilities from these firms, which would not be a good thing to share.
Okay.
There are plenty of good reasons to not be sharing information too freely. That being said, there are still wonderful ways to make communalism, that idea, work. The open source software movement is an excellent example of how greater sharing leads to greater collaboration and therefore greater outputs. It's just much more difficult to monetize, which is not a small obstacle. We all need to earn a living, and knowledge workers in particular have a hard time doing so when we give away the products of our intellects. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a slippery slope for sure.
There's always some tension here, and I don't. We should appreciate that there's value to trying to make communalism work to an extent, but obviously there are limitations as long as we are going to be living with scarcity and abundance will keep us will keep those tensions alive. We
Yep.
need to remember the context in which Merton lived when developing these norms. He was doing much of his research in post World War II America, a time when science was being rapidly applied in business to generate large gains, and still much of the world was ravaged by war, so competition was low and the research budgets were high. It's a lot easier to share in periods of abundance than it is in relative scarcity.
Great point.
It's telling that pro-social behaviors, in my experience, seem to increase when the general level of wealth increases in the populace. Would you agree with that statement?
I'd have to, so pro-social behavior goes up as wealth goes up.
Right. Yeah, I think that there's I've seen the claim that once the average earnings of a citizen in a nation exceeds $5,000 in American dollars, that's when people start being attuned to environmental concerns. That's like the
Okay.
trigger.
Okay.
Uh, Obviously, if you're too poor, you're more focused on day-to-day of just survival on subsistence needs than you are
Right.
about higher level self-actualization needs. And I
Right.
think and I think that the more hunger is further away from you, more distal from you, the more you can focus on trying to be friendly with other people. I think
Okay.
it's
Yeah, and
true.
it comes down to distraction too. They like people always think of New Yorkers as really rude people, but it's a very wealthy place, by the way. It doesn't feel like a very pro-social place, but it's because of the cognitive load that the average New Yorker walking down the street is trying to, they're trying to navigate a very complex day-to-day environment, whereas tourists are not just, they're just focused on having fun. They're trying to find their way around. And New Yorkers that have 16 things on their mind, including not being hit by the bus that nobody else seems to be paying attention to, they they're less um, they tend to be less pro-social, and that has borne out in the research. That so to your point, yes, the fewer, if you will, distractions or priorities that we have, the greater the chance we are going to be pro-social. But if we can be a really, really good person, a very wealthy person, but if we're highly distracted, we're probably not going to engage in a pro-social behavior.
Let me play with that for a second here,
Yeah.
because as a person growing up in the city myself, I grew up in Chicago. I kind of wonder, are we focused on the superficial manifestations of what we consider to be pro-social? Because remember, how many people are living in the greater New York area? Like 15 million people, roughly?
8 million.
8 million? Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, 8 million people living in a small geographic area requires an enormous amount of social cooperation.
True. True.
And sure, people might be a bit more rude or a bit more curt with each other, but they're not hurting each other.
Right. Right.
I think we may be making a mistake if we were to assume just because the way we interact with one another is a bit less gentle, that necessarily means they're uncooperative.
Yeah, it's a perception. Let me say two things. First of all, as somebody that spent a lot of time in New York and Chicago, I think they're very friendly. I mean, people are really great and they are kind. And I love New Yorkers and I love Chicagoans as well, very, very much. And I guess what I'm talking about is the like you talked about being concerned about the environment. That's kind of a macro issue. And I'm sure wealth really has a lot to do with, whether we start focusing on those kind of macro issues. I'm talking more about like, um, an altruistic act. I guess we could go back to our article last week about definitional clarity and construct clarity.
Mhm.
So in this case, pro-social behavior, in my mind, and the research I did on it is, um, organizational citizenship behavior where you pitch in and help without any remuneration. Basically, altruism, gratitude, the kind acts. And in New York, if you're not paying attention, people will run you over. They will. If you're
Yeah,
not following the
yeah,
rules, if you are trying to push your way on a train and not let everybody off first, they're going to body check you. It doesn't mean that they aren't great people if you sit down at a bar and have a beer with them. But in the moment, in the situation really dictates how pro-socially we behave.
yeah. And uh, as you say, this could be a semantic
I
distinction
think it might be. I think it might be.
because
Yeah.
because pro-social again, is the way we govern ourselves in micro interactions. Obviously, the more people trying to be corralled, the more let's say a bit more structure to it. There's more. If one person stops in the middle of the road or the sidewalk, now there's 75 people behind you that are held up.
Yeah,
So there may be generative norms that are put in there to try and encourage people to keep moving. That
true.
might result in what we perceive as pro-social, but maybe that's just another way. It's a refinement of social cooperation.
There
At
you
least
go.
I'm holding it out there as a possibility.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's exactly right. And you're right. It is kind of semantics because, I think we're both right in the realms that we're applying it, but
Right.
pro-social behavior is a very and it's why I love studying it so much
Sure.
because so much of it depends on things like economics and is the room hot or is it cold? People are not
Yeah.
pro-social in a hot room, as the temperature goes up. So, but go ahead.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Okay. Let's go ahead and look at organized skepticism.
great.
Skepticism is a state of doubt about a claim. Organized skepticism is the disposition that researchers should be doubtful about scientific claims unless convinced otherwise by following rigorous interrogation of scientific claims and methods. Organized skepticism contends that if consistent, measurable, and replicable methods are used, researchers can provide confirmatory or disconfirmatory evidence of previous research. Done properly, the scrutiny identifies the conceptual, the logical, and the procedural flaws or questions that can often call into question the results of previous research. Am I on track here? And are you
You
tracking
are
with me?
absolutely.
Now, on the other norms, we raise questions or concerns about disinterestedness, universalism, and communalism. Should we offer similar caveats for organized skepticism?
Uh, that's a big question. Uh, I actually am not sure we do. I mean, the example I gave you before about I think he was a Danish or Dutch researcher that was found to be falsifying. It was because everything he did replicated.
Hmm.
It's like, and that's one of the biggest problems we have in social science research or social psychology specifically is a lot of studies won't replicate.
Yeah.
And so when you start seeing this constant replication, that's a red flag. I don't know if that really answers your question, but it made me think of that. So
Well, it's if it's constantly replicated by the same researcher, that
yeah,
could be a red
yes,
flag. But
yes,
if other people replicate it, then that's a lot more
I
evidence
agree.
there.
I agree. That's a good caveat. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
So I would say that should you have the same caveats for organized skepticism? Absolutely not. The primary function of the scientific method is to correct for individual bias, and organized skepticism is the fundamental mechanism allowing science to do its work. Simply put, if you compromise on the organized skepticism piece, we aren't doing science anymore. This means that as scholars, we must place organized skepticism at the apex of our list of priorities, and we must safeguard that. Because if we lose that piece, the whole endeavor is going to fall apart. Now, in recent years, large swaths of the people have become to question the reliability of our scientific apparatus. I think the crisis of confidence you just alluded to a moment ago in both our scientific or medical and other institutions is tied directly to researchers abandoning this allegiance. We must restore it. This is a big part of what I want from my students. I want to send people out there that prioritize sense making and truth seeking above all else. What say you about that?
Makes me want to quote Maimonides, who said that we must accept the truth, whatever source it comes from.
Agreed.
It's very hard for people to do sometimes. So I think that was a very eloquent argument for the importance of organized skepticism.
So now, after examining each of these norms, what do you want to say about Mertonian norms in a general sense?
I believe that if I were able to go back and start my graduate journey all over, I would probably copy these and put them on my computer so I always remembered what they are and the importance of them. You know, like in my education, I think we hit on all these, but the way you've broken them down, related them to each other, and the examples you give really make a compelling argument for why budding scholars should pay very close attention to them.
Cool. From my chair, as I advanced in wisdom and in years, I become ever more convinced that the world is much more complex than I think it is.
Yeah.
And there's vast disagreement over countless claims, and those people who adhere the most strongly to those claims are often, in the end, the most misguided or the most blind to the nuances that permeates our understanding of what's real. Aristotle warned us that any virtue taken to an extreme becomes a vice. Similarly, any ideology or belief that cannot be expanded or informed by new information becomes rigid and ultimately self-destructive.
Right.
Our adherence to organized skepticism is what keeps us honest. And like everyone, I have my opinions and my perspectives, but I found that even the people I disagree with most fervently often have a point that I should be considering. I have my blind spots, but I become aware of them the more I share my ideas with others and they share theirs with me. Often the best ideas are those that integrate diverse perspectives and diverse approaches. I abandoned ideological purity long ago, and now I only seek ideological parity. That's why I believe in disinterestedness, universalism, communalism, and organized skepticism. What do you think?
Once again, I think that's very well put. There was one point I wanted to make here really quick that going back to that fallacy of expertise, which can creep in when we become too dogmatic or we don't practice organized skepticism. Friedman said that to overcome the fallacy of expertise, that we have to tap into the wisdom of the crowd, that we have to be humble enough to admit that the many are smarter than the few. And collective wisdom shapes business, economy, societies, and nations. So we have to always keep an open mind. And as I said before, we have to accept the truth from whatever source it comes. Even if that source is a source that we highly disagree with, we have to accept it.
Totally agree with all of that. Well, I think we've explored the idea of Mertonian norms for our budding scholars here. I hope that all of you will try to utilize these ideas going forward and apply them to your research. I think we can end it there. Thank you again, Dr. Lindenberger, for another wonderful conversation. Until next time, this has been Dr. Nick Wolf and
Dr. Stephen Lindenberger,
reminding you to think better.
better.
Thanks.